Hi everyone, and welcome to the next video in the Endgame series. This time we're going to look at the advantage of the bishop pair in the endgame, which I think is an important one because there's always so much talk of the strength of the bishop pair in chess. It was Steinitz, the first official world champion, who laid down the rules for how to play with the two bishops against knights, i.e. to take away any strongholds for the knights, so they don't have anywhere to settle. Once this has been achieved, the short-legged knights are no match for the far-reaching bishops. In this first example, we see one of the great endgame players exploiting the advantage of the bishop pair. Karpov, who's one of my own personal all-time favourite players, shows here in instructive style how to take squares away from the knights and at the same time suppress counterplay from the opponent, who was the Romanian Grandmaster Andrei Istratescu. This game is taken from their 2005 match. Karpov had white and opened with d4. And after knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3 and b6, the game has gone into a Queen's Indian defense. And I'm just going to skip on now to the point I want to talk about. So normal moves for this opening. After rook fd1 came bishop takes c3, giving up the bishop pair for some initiative. And queen b6, which is the last book move of the game. Now came c takes d5, c takes d5, and this continuation. g4 expanding on the king side. And knight takes g6, which results in bishops against knights, and it's not long before the heavy pieces come off too. After h takes g6, rook takes c6, queen takes c6, queen e2, king f8, and queen a6, forcing queen takes a6. Now bishop takes a6, and already white has a big edge at plus 0.7. The d6 knight is attacked, and it makes sense for black to get his king involved, as we're now in the end game. So Istratescu here played king e7, and now Karpov played h4, which is a nice move as it fixes the weak doubled g-pawns. It would have been in black's favour if he'd been allowed to play g5 next and try and liquidate the g6 pawn. So now came knight f6, bishop d3, king d7, and king f2. Karpov gets his king active. Now king c6, king e2, knight fe8, king d2, and knight b5. And black's plan for now is clear, simply to improve the position of his knights. And Karpov played a nice move now, subtle and strong. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Bishop e5 is the move, which is an excellent square for the bishop. Not only is it dominating the e8 knight, but it applies pressure to the g7 pawn, and playing f6 to kick the bishop isn't an option because it leaves the g6 pawn too vulnerable, especially at the moment with the knight on e8 and the king on c6. If f6, then bishop takes g6 would be very strong for white now. And as well as that, black also has to look out for the typical advance h5 from white, which in combination with a correctly timed bishop takes g7 sacrifice will lead to the queening of the h-pawn. If, say for example, if h5 is played and black does nothing about it, if he was to play a4 or something, then bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, and h6, and the h-pawn will queen. So next came knight b d6 and bishop f1, which is another nice move from Karpov, his idea being to place his king on d3, bishop on g2, and then play an e4 break with his pawns in order to gain space in the center and deprive the knights of strong central squares in accordance with the teachings of Steinitz. If f6 now, then simply bishop f4, and white's edge has increased. So king b6, king c2, knight b5, bishop g2, king c6, king d3, and knight b d6. If instead knight c3, which looks tempting, White has a strong response a4, taking b5 away from the knight and vastly reducing its scope. There's no en passant capture, of course, so the knight is falling thanks to the king here on d3. So knight d6, and now e4. And after getting all his pieces to the best squares, Karpov surges forward. And it's important to note too that he didn't hurry with this pawn push, waiting until the optimal moment to play it in accordance with the principles we've looked at earlier in this series, i.e. not hurrying when you have a sustainable advantage. So king d7, getting out of the firing line of the bishop, which Karpov promptly reinstated with bishop h3. Now came king e7, bishop f1, king d7, king e3, king e7, and bishop d3, which is slowly and patiently maneuvering and increasing the pressure on the black position. It's typical of Karpov's style. So king d7, and now bishop f4, which is preparing e5, which will deprive the knights of further good squares, in particular d6, and also f6, of course. And there's no effective way for black to stop this. For example, if he tries f6, now comes e5, f takes e5, d takes e5, the knight moves, and g6 is falling with a winning advantage to white. King c6 is what Estratescu did play. So now came e5, now knight c8, it's rerouting to b6, and bishop g5, knight b6, bishop e7, which is a strong penetration into the black position. Now knight d7 and h5, which is easily the strongest move available and one that creates an instructive position. Despite the material equality, black is completely paralyzed by the two powerful bishops. This move, h5, opens a crucial diagonal for the light square bishop. Istratescu now played knight c7 and resigned, presumably having seen that it was completely lost, after h takes g6, f takes g6, and bishop takes g6, with bishop f7 coming next. And Karpov gave his analysis of the game and thought that the best defense, instead of knight c7, at this stage was g takes h5. And after g takes h5, and then for example king c7, now bishop h7, and the bishop's coming to g8 to attack the f pawn. So knight b8, bishop g8, knight c6, and bishop f8, which is tying the e8 knight down to defending the g7 pawn. Now f6. If instead knight d8 to defend f7, now comes king d3, and black is helpless against the threat of bishop takes g7, followed up with the advance of the h-pawn. And it's necessary to move the king before executing this plan, or black would have had, if bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, h6, knight f5 check. If the king's on e3, is going to win the h6 pawn. So play here might go king c6, bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, h6, now knight a5, and it's not checked because the king's moved, and h7, and white will queen next move. So f6 is the right move here instead of knight d8, which is what we just saw. So f6, and now bishop f7, attacking the knight. King d7 is best, and now e takes f6, and bishop takes e8 followed up with bishop takes g7 is also winning, and here white wins no matter how black answers. For example, g takes f6, and black will have to sack a knight to stop the h-pawn from queening, after which it's a matter of technique for white to win. So it was a fine example of endgame skill from Karpov, and a very instructive display of how to use the bishop pair to outmaneuver the knights. And it's important to note that in that game the pawn structure was more or less symmetrical. In open positions with asymmetrical pawn structures, the two bishops are often even stronger because in such positions their long-range ability gives them a competitive advantage over the knights. The bishops are often able to perform several tasks at once, supporting their own passed pawns while blocking the opponent's, for example. Furthermore, in such positions the knights often lack strongholds and they must move to one wing or the other, and with their limited movement, knights are less able to multitask in comparison to the bishops. Okay, that's the end of part 1.